We're talking today with Phil Palmer of Grand Rapids, Michigan, and the interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Okay, Phil, can you start us off with some background on yourself, and to begin with, where and when were you born?
I was born in 1933, May the 23rd, in Lansing, Michigan, and I lived on McKinley Street, which is in the industrial part of Lansing.
Okay, and what did your family do for a living at that time?
My father at the time was collecting pay stations for the Border Water and Light. He went around to the various pharmacies and other places that people could pay their utility bill without having to go downtown. He collected those receipts and took them back to the office.
Okay.
And my mother was a homemaker at the time, but she did later go to work.
Okay, and was your father's work steady during the 30s?
Yes, Lansing was kind of a one-class town. We were all poor, but none of us knew it, really. If you had a job, you were rich, and my father was rich. He had a job the entire time. Because I can recall the Depression, and it was tough for a lot of my compatriots. Yeah.
Okay, and then as you got, we got into the war years, then what did you kind of notice or observe about what was going on then?
Well, I was fairly young. I was 8 years old when Pearl Harbor took place, and I don't have much awareness of that. I knew something important was happening. I didn't quite understand what it all was. But I did understand that we had a lot of war movies when I went to the Saturday matinees for 12 cents. And I'd stop in the gas station on the way, and they had these aircraft identification cards for free. So I could identify a whole lot of enemy and U.S. airplanes. And I collected those, and collection unfortunately is long gone. People never do save things they ought to save, and save a lot of things they shouldn't save.
All right, so you're doing that. Of course, as the war is going on and you're getting kind of a little bit older, you kind of getting a little bit better sense. By 1945, you've got a little bit better sense of what's going on.
My first recollection during the war of what the war was really all about is I remember reading Guadalcanal Diary and being, of course, appalled at what was going on. And we saw the newsreels at these matinees, and so I became more and more aware of the war. I was certainly very aware of VE Day and VJ Day when they occurred.
Okay. Now, let's see. When did you finish high school?
In 1951,
okay.
June.
All right. Now, by that time, the Korean War had started.
Yes, it had.
All right. And there were... Now, did you consider at some point going... I mean, and of course, when you went to college, you were also thinking about the military at the same time, correct?
Right.
Okay. How does that work for you?
I remember during my senior year, when the war was over, there was an assembly in the auditorium, and they remembered all of the graduates of the school who had died during the war. And I remember the young sisters of these men leaving the auditorium in tears had a profound effect on me. It was something I'll never forget.
Okay, now you're talking about the end of World War II?
End of World War II.
Okay, so this was in your high school then?
This was in high school, right.
That's
So in 1951, I was literally ambushed by my father and the assistant principal, who did not think favorably upon my plan to go to the assembly line at General Motors for my future. And we couldn't afford college. I did have a full scholarship to go to Michigan Mines and Technology, as it was called then.
Is that Michigan Tech now?
Michigan Tech, a full 4-year scholarship. But even that was going to be pretty tough. I wanted to take engineering, I knew that. Benjamin Lair, who was Lieutenant Commander in the Naval Reserve, was our assistant principal, and he talked to my father and said that they needed to find a way to get me to college. And he called me into the office and told me about this Navy ROTC scholarship program. Navy did not like to call it a scholarship program, but indeed it was. And told me that he discussed it with my father, and my father thought it was a good idea, so he prompted me to apply, and I took the competitive exam, which was essentially at the time the SAT. It was even supervised and managed by the Princeton testing people. It was an all-day-long thing, a whole ton of people there. 3 of us were selected from the Lansing, East Lansing area. One of them was my best friend in high school, And we ended up going out to the University of Wisconsin together. We were roommates for 4 years.
Okay. Now, back when you were in high school and you were figuring you'd go on the assembly line and that kind of, did it occur to you that you might also get drafted into the Army?
It really didn't, no. And actually, when we got into college, it became very obvious to me that many of my classmates were there because they didn't want to go to Korea. It never entered my mind I might be going to Korea. I don't know why. I was certainly bright enough to figure that out, but it's just nothing that I considered.
Okay. Yeah.
And we called we referred to ourselves as draft dodgers. We all had 1S deferments, but we also had deferments because we were actually in the service as Navy ROTC midshipmen.
Right. Okay. Now, what did the ROTC program training actually consist of while you were at college?
We had laboratory sessions on Tuesdays and Thursdays. They were generally drilling during good weather, and then classroom work during the winter, which is a large part of the year in Wisconsin. And then 3 days a week we had formal classroom work, which received credit, but not toward graduation, but it was accredited. I actually ended up with 2 degrees, one Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering and the other one Bachelor of Naval Science. One had to be careful because if you qualified for the Bachelor of Science degree in Naval Science before the other one, you might very well be gone, having made a considerable investment in the other degree already.
All right.
So that had to be well managed.
So the idea there was that once you had completed a degree, you would kind of go actually become be commissioned, be an active duty naval officer, and they didn't particularly care to wait for 2 degrees.
That's correct.
Okay.
No,
so
you had to have a degree, and if you had a degree, you were commission eligible and commission ready.
All right. Now, did you also do summer training?
Yes, we went on 3 summer cruises, we called them. The first one was I was aboard USS Roanoke, a light cruiser, and we went to Lisbon, Portugal, and all of them made stops in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, now very much in the news. And I enjoyed those cruises. We also went to, in the senior cruise, for what we called our first class cruise, went in the destroyer, the William R Rush, DD 714, and we went to Dublin, Ireland. I got sick on that cruise and got highlined which is a way of transporting people between ships, and I was in a litter. They run a wire between the 2 ships, and away you go. They almost dipped me in the drink on the way. Couldn't figure out what it was, but I hit 106 fever, which ruined my opportunity to go to Paris, which is what I really, of course, as a young man wanted to do. So I missed that altogether. Between those 2 cruises, we went on an aviation amphibious, what we called a cruise, but it was here in the United States. We went to Little Creek, Virginia for amphibious training, and then we went down to Corpus Christi, Texas, and to some remote fields for practical experience in what's flying all about. It was an unfortunate year for the aviation crews. Plane going from, they did the cruise in 2 phases. Half of us were in Little Creek while the other half were down in Corpus Christi, and then they swapped them. And bringing the people north to Little Creek while we were on our way south, they flew them in what we called flying boxcars. They stopped in, I think it was in Florida, probably in Jacksonville, to refuel. And when they took off on their way to Little Creek, the plane crashed and killed virtually everyone from the unit at Rice University, and I think half of the unit at Oklahoma University, their junior classes, or what we called second class. They didn't recruit many people out of my class to naval aviation.
Suppose not.
Yeah.
All right.
And they had strange policies then. Maybe they weren't so strange, but they wouldn't know. The fact that the accident had occurred, of course, was national news. Lots of people were terribly alarmed. There were lots of parents with people going one way or the other. They announced on national news that it had occurred, but no list of names. So everyone was left to wonder. For a long period of time, was there a son gone? I say son because there were no women at that time.
Okay. Now, when you were doing the amphibious training, were you actually working in landing craft, or were you on
We
transports?
did.
Or?
I got to go down one of those cargo nets and into one of those landing boats going up and down along the side. It's a real thrill. And you need to catch the landing craft while it's coming up and near the top, because then the motion is slow and because if you wait till it's on its way down, you may have a long trip. Gravity will get you there, but not the way you want.
Okay. And when you did the aviation training, what were you actually doing?
We flew in SNJ flights, and unfortunately one of those crashed also with a midshipman on board and killed him. I had gone to an aviation safety class just before that announcement came out to us, in which they said the SNJ had such a terrific glide ratio, it was virtually impossible to have a fatal accident, and they promptly had one.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, so that also kind of led to a less than enthusiastic feeling for naval aviation for most of us.
Right. Okay. Now, and then when you were actually on a cruiser or a destroyer, what would you actually do on a cruise?
Well, as a third classman on our third class cruise, which was the first one right after our freshman year, we were just assimilated within the crew. We stood enlisted person watches, usually under the supervision of an enlisted person. And so we rotated through all the various enlisted watch stations on the ship, in general learning what shipboard life was about. Mm-hmm. We lived in an enlisted cruise space that had been made available to us. Not very comfortable quarters, mm-hmm. I might add. And then in the first class cruise, I was the naval midshipman executive officer. I followed the number 2 officer on the ship around, and put together watch bills and did other officer-like assignments. They were far and away the best training I had to become a naval officer on my first tour, mm-hmm. Far exceeding any classroom work I had.
Right.
Although I did learn to march.
Mm-hmm.
I did learn the manual of the sword. So later on, when we put a ship in commission, the boardroom was asked, who here knows the uniform of the sword? And I said, I do, and that got me the officer of the deck job during the commissioning ceremony for the ship.
All right. Okay. So when then did you finish college and get your commission? I had to go to summer school because there was a required summer course in the chemical engineering program called Unit Operations, a laboratory course. There was a requirement for getting my degree. The Navy allowed me to do that, thank goodness. And so I actually graduated after the rest of the class graduated in September. I was commissioned September the 22nd, 1955 in the commanding officer's office. I flew back from home and got my commission, and then picked up some stuff at home on the way and flew off to my first ship. Okay. Now, do they allow you to express a preference for where you might go or be stationed or anything like that?
I believe they did, but it didn't mean much. The assignments really had pretty much to do with how ready they thought you were to accept some responsibility aboard a ship.
Okay. So what was your first assignment?
Well, my first assignment was via a 10-week training course to get me ready for the assignment I would have in the ship. In a practical sense, I went to damage control, and ABC, it was called Atomic, Biological, and Chemical Defense Training at the Philadelphia Navy Shipyard in Philadelphia, and I was there for 10 weeks. And then I went to the ship, which was in the shipyard in Brooklyn, Navy Yard in Brooklyn, New York, of course, and I was assigned to the ship as supernumerary. There was not a billet for me, because I was in what the Navy called stashed for my next billet, which was going to be the damage control assistant, putting an identical ship into commission. Because at the time we were putting a lot of these DERs in commission to be stationed on the distant early warning line up in the North Atlantic.
Okay, a DER as a destroyer escort?
DER, right.
Yeah, okay. So the first ship you were on was?
The USS Strickland, DER 333.
Right, okay. And I guess before we get back there, when you you had your 10 weeks in the Naval Shipyard with the training. I mean, was there any particular training you got for the damage control that wound up being useful?
Oh yes, very much so. The training itself was very useful, but what was really useful about the tour was it made a semi-cultured person out of me, as having been an engineer. I used to walk up Broad Street from the BOQ at Broad Snyder to the City Hall, passing on the way the Academy of Music, which is where Philadelphia Orchestra held forth. I had never heard a symphony orchestra. They sold tickets to service people if they came in uniform in an obstructed view area for $2. And so I went and heard Eugene Ormandy in my very first symphony orchestra and was hooked.
All right.
And I went to the Philadelphia Museum. I saw the steps where Rocky went up in the city library. All of that stuff that a kid from Lansing growing up beside the railroad tracks, never even imagined.
All right. So now you get your first assignment. How long was it before you actually went out to sea?
Well, it took us, as I recall, they were still about midway through their overhaul. I think it wasn't a long time, maybe a month.
Okay.
And then we went to our home port, which was Goat Island in Newport. Goat Island is now a very swanky place. Not so then. There was a ferry that took you back and forth between the island and the mainland. It was a car ferry. And it was kind of an austere surrounding. But Newport itself, of course, was a fascinating place. Went to the tennis museum and did all sorts of things. And chased lots of girls. And
now, at that stage, were they already doing tours of the mansions and those kinds of things? Or did that...
Yeah, they were, and I did some of that when I wasn't chasing girls, yeah.
All right. And then once you're there up in Newport, I mean, do you just stay in port, or do you go out on cruises, or what?
No, we went out to take our station on this distant early warning line, which was at sea. It was populated by, I believe there were 4 of these stations. They were circles, 50 miles in radius out in the North Atlantic, up very close to the ice flows. In fact, we frequently encountered ice flows and icebergs. It was terrible, terrible operating environment, horrible seas, and terribly cold in the wintertime. Wind cold would cut right through you on the bridge. No amenities on the bridge. There was a canvas roof sort of thing over the top and some rudimentary windshields, and that was it. You were out in the elements.
Yeah. For people who wouldn't necessarily know, I mean, how big is the destroyer escort?
I think it was somewhere in excess of 300 feet. It was not a large ship. They were destroyer escorts, the World War II variety, that were converted by putting additional superstructure on them to house a lot of electronic gear, and then some very the superstructure was aluminum on a steel hull, and that involved a lot of complications, over time in terms of corrosion and so forth. And then we had a lot of high-level electronic search gear, antennas and so forth. They were not terribly comfortable at sea because they were top heavy. I remember rolling to 45 degrees, and then the horizontals are more vertical than the verticals, and not fun either. I remember one time being on the bridge and telling everybody to stand by because I saw a really large wave coming toward us, and everyone hold on, and it hit us, and holding on to the center line Polaris for dear life, it still swept me off my feet, took me clear across the deck and crashing into the bulkhead. Yeah, it was not a fun time. But we were supposed to look for incoming Soviet aircraft, bombers. Never saw one, of course. But we did occasionally have drills when they would send in friendlies to see how well we were doing in our assignment. Also submarines to see if we were detecting submarines. Some ships did not manage to detect the submarines, and that always caused a big furor. So we were 3 weeks out and 2 weeks in, 3 weeks out, 2 weeks in. Terrible, terrible life for married people. I was a bachelor. I used to swap duties on Christmas in order to have New Year's Eve off. That kind of stuff went on.
Yeah. And you're out there and you're doing this sort of Cold War era. There's not a hot war going on at that point for the Americans. How seriously did you take the Soviet threat? Did you think you really might well see something coming over, or did you figure probably not?
A little bit of both. No, I knew that it was a serious threat, and I knew we had very good equipment and that we would detect them. Some at least over 100 miles away from where we were, and we were a long way off from the offshore of the U.S. So it was a pretty good distant warning. We also had communications with the aircraft that were flying the barrier patrol. They flew a racetrack course up along the line, supposedly 50 miles on either side, but frequently they were way off course. Sometimes we didn't see them at all. But they did have a downlink capability, so that didn't work very well. It was very rudimentary stages of development, but they could transfer what they were seeing to our radar scopes, and we could see what they were seeing on occasion.
Okay.
We had some electronic countermeasures gear, so we could look for intelligence signals.
Okay. Now, did you eventually get a regular assignment on that ship, or did you just remain an extra?
Yeah, well, I had a regular assignment. I was made the main propulsion assistant, which is a billet that didn't exist, but that was the counterpart of the district of the damage control assistant. The first job I got was given to me by the executive officer, Wayne Eugene Meyer, who eventually became an admiral and the father of Aegis, and I followed him through my career, as it turned out. I had many assignments in which I reported to him, not just his first one. He had me up in his executive officer's cabin, which was kind of like a broom closet, and told me he had a job for me. He wanted me to take over the ship fitter operation. They were supposed to be laying down a new deck in the mess decks, tile. That was a ship's force assignment, and they were behind schedule, and there were 3 first class in the shop, and they were each in a different rating, and they were all, one was a pipe fitter and one was a damage controlman, and I forgot what the other one was. Very similar in their skills. And they were prima donnas, and no one was in charge and everyone was in charge. So here I am, fresh caught ensign, and these guys much older than I am, and certainly a lot more experienced and probably wiser at that time than I was, and I was supposed to go down and take charge of them. Well, that worked out.
How did that work out?
Well, it worked out because I went back and I had a chat with them and asked them what they were doing and how were they going about it, and told them that, well, I'd kind of like to be involved, and maybe if they were having some support problems on the ship, not getting what they needed to do their job or whatever, maybe I could help them in that regard, and managed to win them over. Lesson number 1 in leadership, first out of the box.
Oh, so you're treating experienced, basically NCOs, if you will.
They were all older than I was.
Yeah, with a certain amount of respect and acting like they knew how to do their job, rather than you going in and just telling them.
Yeah, the problem was they weren't doing their job. That was the problem. Not that they didn't know how.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So, how long did you stay with the Strickland?
I was there about 18 months, and then I got orders to go to the next ship, USS Hissem. These ships were almost all of them, I think, maybe all of them, named after World War II torpedo pilots who were died in action in the torpedo squadron action you may be familiar with. And they named ships after most of these young ensigns, Lieutenant JGs, who lost their life in World War II. So Hissem was another one of those ships named for Ensign Hissem. I think he was an ensign. And I was the commissioning damage control assistant. I was in the pre-commissioning detail, which was in Newport, Rhode Island, and then there was another detachment that was with the ship in the shipyard, which was in Boston, in the Charlestown Naval Shipyard, which is in Boston. And that's where the chief engineer, who I would be reporting to, was working, and I was down doing paperwork, writing orders and instructions and regulations for the engineering department.
Okay. So the idea was they would finish with the actual physical work on it in the Navy Yard, and then they would send it up to Newport, and you would commission it there?
No, we put the ship in commission in Boston, and
Okay.
eventually, when it came appropriate, when we could live on board,
Okay.
they sent the pre-commissioning detail in Newport up to Boston to join the ship. And my parents came out for the pre-commissioning ceremony, and that was the first time I had ever even seen a commissioning ceremony, let alone be in one. And as I said, I was the ceremonial officer, and so that was just an assignment like the previous one, except I got eventually some real responsibilities in the ship. I eventually became the chief engineer, and then I wanted to cross train, so I asked if I could go to the operations department. So I was the CIC officer for a while, and then I was the operations officer, senior watch officer. Eventually I was the number 3 person. That's, in those small ships, that's about how it went. You went from bottom to top, in my case, a year and a half.
Well, how many officers would you have on a destroyer escort?
My recollection is there was a dozen or so of us.
And did they rotate off fairly regularly, or?
Well, in general, ships in the Navy in those days, and I think it's fairly well the same now, the whole crew turns over in the course of 3 years. So about a third of the ship turns over every year. That's why they have things called refresher training, usually held in Guantanamo, by the way. Or if you're putting a ship in commission, they have something called shakedown training. So I'd already been through refresher training with Strickland, and then I went through shakedown training with Hissem.
Okay, and so is that a shakedown cruise that you take, or how does that
You
work?
go down, and there's a fleet training group down there, and they come aboard every morning at 0800, and they give you your orders for the day you put out to sea, and they run drills on the ship all day long and grade you. And woe be it to the ship that falls behind in progress. In particular, woe be it to the commanding officer of the ship. And I was damage control assistant, and that's the focus of an awful lot of the training. I had a lot of pressure put on me in that assignment. In fact, the captain ordered me to go ashore one night. Said, "You need a break."
Okay. Now, did you spend most of your time sort of just in and out of Newport, or did you, at least at that stage, or?
Yes, it was pretty much the same as as it had been aboard Strickland.
Okay. And then once you've gotten through the shakedown, now do you go out on a longer cruise, or what happens next?
No, then we went up to Newport, to Goat Island, and away we went doing exactly what I'd done aboard Strickland.
Okay.
We did make some other ports while we were down in Guantanamo, and we made one trip, I remember, to, shoot, the name of the place escapes me right now. The town where the Cuban Revolution started. I'm trying to remember the name of it. To the west of Havana.
All right.
Yeah. Well, anyway, and on the South Shore. To the west, I should have said, at Guantanamo. I remember going in there and seeing the slogans, "Yankee Go Home," and all that stuff going on. It was not too much later that the revolution broke out in the mountains.
Right. Okay. So that's sort of going on at that time. But then when you're back to your kind of North Atlantic sort of lookout station, or whatever.
Yes, exactly. Right.
Now, was the Hissem essentially the same model of ship as the Strickland? Or
They all progressed through their lifetime with upgrades in the electronic suites, because they basically were a platform for electronics. So we had different electronics than Strickland had, but in other regards, pretty much the same. They both had diesel engineering power plants, and one of the things I did aboard before I became chief engineer in Hissem was they sent me to New London to the subbase, because the submarines that were the diesel submarines, many of them had exactly the same propulsion plant that the DEs had. So they sent me down there to learn about the main propulsion plant to the sub school.
Okay. And then how long did you stay aboard the Hissem?
I was there for another year and a half, and at that point in time my obligated service was up, and I had to either opt to go out and revert to I was commissioner regular officer in the U.S. Navy. I had to make a decision to stay, asked to be retained on as a regular officer, or asked to be placed on inactive assignment as a reserve officer. Well, I wasn't ready to make a decision yet. I wasn't sure. I had an epiphany when I was in Hissem. We lived in a place called Boys Town back until I made chief engineer, and then I had my very own stateroom. But Boys Town was back in the lower decks in the aft part of the ship, very bad riding place, where we'd all gather and badmouth the command structure and what they didn't know, and we could do much better. All that stuff went on. And at some point in time, I said, you know, you're not making anybody miserable here except yourself. These people probably know something you don't know. And after that, my attitude changed, and that's when I began to get these department head assignments and realized there was a lot more to this than I knew, but I didn't know enough yet to decide whether I wanted to stay in.
Okay.
So I asked for Naval ROTC instructor duty. And for that, I would remain on active duty as a reserve officer. I would go to the reserves.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to go back to the University of Wisconsin, but the policy did not allow you to return to the unit where you'd been commissioned.
Mm-hmm.
So I asked for the University of Michigan, because I thought, well, I can get home from there and
Mm-hmm.
see some of my old high school people and my parents and so forth. So, and that they gave me that assignment. So I went to Ann Arbor for 2 years in naval instructor duty at the University of Michigan. Actually had appointments as an assistant professor, believe it or not. They appointed us assistant professors
Mm-hmm.
so that they could put us on faculty committees. And the interesting thing about that was our contemporaries in the Army and the Air Force ROTC, the university wanted to pay these people a nominal amount so that they really could make them serve on these committees. The Navy said, no, that's dual compensation. That's against our rules in the Navy. They can serve on the committees, but they cannot receive the pay.
Oh.
So I got to be on faculty committees and not receive any pay. Although I don't recall ever being called to any duty on any faculty committees, but that was the whole gist of the thing.
Okay. And so what was that job like?
I found it was very a tough job. I was exhausted by the end of a week. I mean, I'm only 3 years out of college myself, and I'm teaching college students, and I'm trying to keep ahead of them. And that was kind of tough. And I was teaching naval engineering plants that I'd never served in.
Mm-hmm.
I'd never served in a steam plant except on a midshipman cruise, fortunately. I had some experience there. But I did teach also damage control, and that was fairly easy for me. And then I taught leadership and justice. Right after the Korean War, the government became very disenchanted about the behavior of POWs who were taken in prisoner in Korea. Many of them had not collaborated, but they had cooperated with the enemy in making statements and so forth. That the Navy decided that that was a moral failure on the part of their officer corps. So the Navy established something called General Order 21, I think it was called. General Order 21 dealt with leadership, moral leadership, if you can imagine that in this day and age. And I was one among the first instructors at NROTC units to have to teach moral leadership and military justice. So I audited a course. Michigan actually had a course in leadership,
Mm-hmm.
not military leadership, but a course in leadership. So in the psychology department. So I took a psychology department course for audit in military leadership, rather, to prepare for this course. It was very interesting.
Okay. Now, what would the moral part be? I mean, I guess my understanding was that people who were taken prisoner in Korea got essentially tortured or forced to say all sorts of things. It was
Mm-hmm.
not exactly voluntary compliance, so they're happily bad-mouthing the United States or anything else like that. Was that sort of understood by the people planning this program, or what would you actually be teaching them in this moral part of things?
I basically made it into an ethics course, not particularly related to being a POW at all.
Mm-hmm.
And I did case studies. I prepared case studies, what would you do if,
Mm-hmm.
kind of thing. And those were interesting. These are all bright young men, so I kind of enjoyed doing that.
Okay. And then, so what years are you actually doing that? When are you at Michigan?
I was there from 1958 to 1960.
Okay. And then you're actually back home in the States, and for the most part functioning in the civilian world at this
Yes.
point. So does your civilian life resume at this point?
It did. I was doing both at once. I traveled home not nearly as much as I thought I would to Lansing. It was a long drive, and you can't go home again.
Yeah.
Pretty much turned out to be true. And I was interested in dating. By this time I was wanting to settle down with a wife. And I wanted a family. So I went through in order. I went through the airline hostesses, as they were called then. Their schedules you just could not deal with. And then I went through the nurses, and there were lots of nurses in Ann Arbor. They had schedules you just really couldn't deal with. And so I ended up with school teachers, and I met a school teacher, and I'm still married to her 53 years later.
All right. So now you've gotten yourself married, you've had 2 years of ROTC duty. Now you had been not sure what direction you wanted to take at the time you took this.
No.
By 1960, have you figured out what you want to do?
Yes, as a matter of fact, before that, in 1959, I applied to augment back into the regular Navy. And I was motivated, believe it or not, by the Marine officer instructor who thought he saw some potential in me and thought I really ought to make a career out of the service. And he was an exemplary military officer. I really admired him, and I guess I said to myself, I'd kind of like to be like him. And so I decided to stay in. And there were other people on the staff that I respected. One of them was the executive officer named Ralph Banfield, a commander who was a graduate of Central Michigan University. He was quite an athlete at Central. Everybody on campus knew him. When I walked across campus with him, we couldn't walk 50 feet before somebody would stop and talk with him. And he was a super guy. He got ready to, during my final year, he made his annual trip to Washington, to the Bureau of Naval Personnel, to see what kind of assignments he could get for his officers who were due to be reassigned. And he asked me, he didn't actually ask me what I wanted, but he said he'd see what he could do for me. And he got me a command at sea assignment.
Okay. And so what was your next assignment?
That was commanding officer of USS Meadowlark, a minesweeper, coastal minesweeper.
Okay. And where was that ship based?
In Charleston, South Carolina.
Okay. Now describe a little bit now what that experience was like.
That was amazing, in one word. I loved it. I was, as much as you could be in the Navy, I was in command. The ship was mine. I was responsible for the people aboard it in every sense of the word. It was an awakening, a real awakening. We had really good people because we were essentially on independent duty. You don't do a lot of minesweeping and formation. We did do some formation training just for purposes of keeping the officer skills up in tactics and ships, but for the most part we operated independently. Most of the senior petty officers were on independent duty assignments, so they were all pretty much handpicked by their detailers as people that could operate on their own without a lot of senior experienced in their skill area supervisors. So it was a really good crew. As I said when I got changed, if I could handpick the crew, it would have been none other.
Yeah. Now, how exactly does that happen? I mean, who is deciding who goes on to serve on this minesweeper? Whose decision?
Well, we
that?
have this great bureaucracy in Washington called the Bureau of Naval Personnel, and it has there's a chief of naval personnel, and then there's a couple of other flag officer kinds of assignments within the bureau. Actually, there's an assistant secretary of the Navy also for personnel. There are lots of people managing personnel, and there's an enlisted side, which is supervised by officers, but most of the detailing assignments are indeed made and then ratified by officers, by senior enlisted people, and then there's the officer side. And basically the assignments are made by what billets do we have to fill, and who do we have coming up for assignment, and what's their skill set, and how well do they manage? Do they match up, rather?
All right. And so how does a minesweeper get lucky? I mean, how is that? Was there the idea that you had to have people who could function without a lot of supervision, and so that's part of what you look for when you make that assignment?
Well, in my case, I got there because of Ralph Banfield.
Yeah, but I mean your crew, because you were talking about how good the crew
Oh.
was and how unusually good they were.
Yeah, they knew what assignments had to be filled. The enlisted people did.
Okay.
They managed the enlisted people by rating as opposed to rate.
Mm-hmm.
Rate comes into it in terms of the seniority, but rating is the skill set that the person has. So they know what vacancies there are that have to be filled, and they know who they have in their basket that they
Right.
pluck. And
Okay. And then did you spend most of your time in port or out at sea, or how did that work?
I actually had two different tours in the ship, essentially. The first year, which was the year before I was married and still courting long distance, the ship was underway a lot. We did a lot of training. I was sent off to on a very special mission called the Swan Island Patrol, which was far, far, far away down off the coast of Honduras. With another minesweeper. Two of us went down to relieve two minesweepers are already down there. So, and then we had to do our own training to compete for scoring among the ships. Competition is for the same purpose it always is to motivate people and make them do better than somebody else that they want to beat. So the ships have competitive levels and training and so forth. So did a lot of that. So we're underway a lot of the time. The Swan Island Patrol was one of the most interesting things in my Navy career because it was involved, I didn't find out until much later, in the Bay of Pigs operation. We were sent down there, and the two of us traveled down together on a trip not intended for coastal minesweepers. We were supposed to do exactly what the title would imply, stay fairly close to the coast. We were not open ocean, all that seaworthy, although we did prove that the ships really turned out to be that seaworthy. We had to go first to Roosevelt Roads, which is where the commander of the Caribbean Sea Frontier was, to what was called in-chop, and that is to place the ships under his operational control, give him an opportunity to look at the ships if he chose to, and determine whether or not they were ready for him to do that. And then we went from there to Guantanamo Bay, where we each went up into the base commander's office and received sealed orders that we were told not to open until we were at least 3 miles beyond the coast, which is what we declared to be international waters in the U.S. And headed off toward, we knew our destination. And we knew nothing about what this was all about. I opened the envelope the first time, and the subsequent envelopes when we went down for repeated assignments in the same stations were all the same. And it essentially said we were to defend and repel invasion by whatever force was necessary. And I thought to myself, what? I have what the Navy called, it was a rifle by Navy terminology. If it's got rifling in the barrel, it's called a rifle, no matter what the caliber. But we call those 20 millimeter cannons. We had a 20 millimeter cannon on the forecastle, primarily there to destroy floating mines. And then we had some Browning automatic rifles, BARs as they're called, and some sidearms, and that was it. That was our repel any invaders by whatever means necessary equipment. It was then I realized that there was a lot more to this than we knew. I knew that we were down there at the request of the State Department. When we got there, we went ashore to, I went down first, as I recall, and I think the other ship, USS Parrott, they went down and relieved us while we went back to Guantanamo between tours. Went ashore to greet the people on the island, and we were told that they were a radio station for a commercial shipping company that operated in the Caribbean, delivering supplies in between islands and so forth, a commercial enterprise. And this was their control center, where they controlled their fleet of commercial ships. Well, these guys were all wearing white shirts with button-down collars, and they had crew cuts. And that seemed rather strange. That did not seem merchant marine-like to me. They told us we were free to come aboard anytime during daylight hours. It was a nice beach. We could go swimming. There were sea turtles there. We made some turtle soup on occasion. We could play softball and during the day, but don't come up shore at night because it's patrolled by dogs, they told us. Well, I found out years later, actually I really became fairly well aware of what we were talking about, when the Bay of Pigs invasion occurred and aborted, because we were then released from this assignment. And that's when I realized for the first time these were probably CIA operatives, and that was really probably a CIA radio station, which is exactly what it was, intended to motivate the people ashore after the invasion to rise in insurrection and support the invasion, which they never did.
All right. And this is off the coast of Honduras, though. So,
Yes.
So in some ways away, not
And
at Cuba, yeah.
And the going story for us was it was disputed island under the jurisdictions of, depending on whose side you favored, the U.S., Honduras, or Guatemala.
Okay.
It eventually ended up, we ceded it to Honduras many years later.
All right. And then where in this process did you wind up getting married? Or when?
Right after I returned from the Swan Island Patrol, and that was kind of knuckle whitening because I wasn't sure I was going to get back in time for the wedding, because the wedding, you know how weddings are set well in advance. But the executive officer relieved me while I went on leave, and I flew out to Ann Arbor. We had a week of counseling from the minister and telling us all the stuff that at our point in life we pretty well knew. And then we got married in Ann Arbor, families all present and so forth. And for our honeymoon, we drove back to the ship. But we did drive back via Stratford, Ontario, because my wife wanted to go to the Shakespeare Festival, which is in its early years. First she wanted to go to New Orleans, and I explained to her that wasn't quite on the way to Charleston. And then she said, well, how about we go to Stratford? And I gave up and said, yeah, well, we'll go to Stratford, so we did.
But it's at least not too far out of the way, a little bit north before you go south, but okay. Now, once you were married, did she stay back in Michigan and continue working at that point? Or?
No, she got a job teaching in South Carolina.
Okay.
In a school in North Charleston. Most of her students were from the Air Force Base. It was at Charleston Air Force Base, which was basically a logistics Air Force Base at the time. And that's when my operating tempo changed somewhat, and I did mostly local operating. I wasn't sent on anything like the Swan Island again. I did make a very big mistake, however, early on. Her birthday is February the 8th. So on February the 8th, it turned out the op area was open and available for individual ship training, and I forgot it was her birthday, and I assigned my own ship underway on her birthday, the first birthday since we were married.
Oops.
Yeah, oops.
No, you survived that one.
Yeah, we're still together.
Okay. Now you have an assignment change not too long after that, and you finish
Yes.
the Meadowlark. What comes next for you?
Well, this was an era when the Navy felt, and probably justifiably so, that naval officers really needed advanced education. Particularly they were favoring engineering because they saw the technology curve ramping up sharply. So I was sent, and so was my running mate in USS Barrett. We were sent off to the US Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey. That was a terrific tour, but I was only there for a year because they mentioned the availability of something called the Advanced Science Program. And I was interested in surface chemistry. I was interested because of my tours in the DEs and the terrific corrosion problems. I was interested in knowing a lot more about corrosion in maritime atmospheres. So I looked for programs that would offer such things, and I applied at MIT, and I applied at Ohio State University, both of whom had very good programs. Mars Fontana down at Ohio State was very good, and of course MIT was MIT. They both accepted me, and in fact, this is going to really sound stupid now, but MIT offered me a stipend. They were going to pay me $3,400 a year, I think it was, to be there. The Navy, of course, said, no, you can't do that. That's dual compensation. And I said, well, you know, I'm not going to be happy being there, not receiving pay I know I could receive, but doing the same thing without it. So I'll go to Ohio State. We'll be close to family again, and when will we have that opportunity again? So I went to Ohio State, and but I don't like to tell many people in Michigan that I actually went to Ohio State.
All right. Now, at the year in Monterey, what were you doing there?
I was in the Weapons Systems engineering curriculum, and I was, but during the last, it was a trimester system, and during the last trimester I was taking a program that was tailored specifically to me, so I was taking advanced chemistry courses, because by then they knew I'd been selected and there was no point in keeping me in the other path.
Okay. Now, a lot of people in that area went to Monterey for language training. Did you get any of that?
I did. Because school at Ohio State, of course, started in September like it does everywhere, and if you wanted to be in phase relative to the required courses before you could start doing research, why you needed to be in the right loop. So I had a fourth trimester, as it were, with nothing to do in Monterey. That was not satisfactory, of course, to the U.S. Navy. I could have played golf, terrific golfing place. But instead, I took, first I took German. And I was fairly good at language, I thought. I took 4 years of Latin in high school, loved every minute of it. German was a different kind of thing, and I did not take to German at all. So I thought, Army Language School is offering scientific Russian. How about that? So I did. I went over to the language school and took scientific Russian, where they taught reading level, reading of scientific literature, and we read a lot of scientific literature, but they also had us do some reading in their cultural works. For example, I remember reading part of Pico something Dama, the Queen of Spades.
Okay, Big Dom, yes.
Yes.
Or however they pronounce it.
I remember
in
reading
Russian.
that in Russian, and so that was interesting. The instructors, the requirement was they had to be native speakers, and they all were, and some of them had fascinating stories. One of my instructors had gained his freedom by driving his tank out of Berlin, tank and all. Another one had lost his arm in a saber charge as a toddler during one of the many uprisings in Russia, pre-Soviet Union. So he was an interesting character. They drank vodka like I never saw in my life. We had a graduation party, and they drank their vodka in tumblers of like drinking glasses, and drank it like it was water, and never seemed to affect them at all. So anyway, yes, I took, and that proved to be useful at Ohio State because they required a foreign language and a independent research and dissertation and defense of the dissertation to get a master's degree. So I, of course, did Russian as my foreign language. I had to take a proficiency test, which I managed to pass. And
okay, and then actually at Ohio State, then what's the main stuff you wound up doing?
I did a research project. I chose to challenge a technical article by a Russian scientist named Deryagan, who expounded a theory on the electrostatic forces and their influence over their attractive influence over the bonding of surfaces. And I thought that he gave far more to it than really was merited. So I set up a device, developed my own equipment. I ordered a ballistic galvanometer. I don't think they had many orders for ballistic galvanometers, but I ordered one and built this, had the shop build me a plastic lucite box that I could put a copper plug in, and bought a whole lot of mercury that was exposed to the air before anybody knew occasionally there were puddles of it running across the floor, long before anybody was aware of all those problems. And I was off in something, believe it or not, called the War Building, in my very own little laboratory space, doing this experiment, which I successfully defended. And then I was asked by my supervising professor to submit it to the, I think it was the Journal of Polymer Science, maybe. I don't remember for sure. Anyway, I did, and of course it was peer reviewed there, and it was rejected because the editor-in-chief turned out to be the guy who wrote the original article I was challenging. That may not be the only reason, but probably factored into it.
Well, I mean, as far as you can tell, I mean, were you right? Had he overstated his case, or?
Oh, I think so. But there's no doubt that if you take a piece of saran wrap, for example, a lot of that is electrostatic. Mm-hmm. And there are many surfaces you put together and pull them apart. Of course, you see sparks fly. So there is such a force, but I don't think it's a major force in most adhesive processes.
Okay. And did you learn stuff that was actually useful in terms of what you could bring back to the Navy if you're trying to deal with issues of corrosion?
I learned a lot about corrosion, not from my experiment, but by the courses that I took as prerequisites to doing my independent research.
Okay.
Mars G. Fontana was a really great corrosion expert, and I learned a lot from him.
All right.
Found out exactly why those ships fell apart. Why, if you did structural test firing, the first aid boxes all fell off the bulkheads. Why sometimes the superstructure cracked.
This is just because the steel and the aluminum don't get along?
But we were in a great giant electrolytic cell.
Mm-hmm.
We were a great big battery at sea.
Okay. All right. Now, once you've completed that, now we've made it here, it's about 1965 now that you finished that. Now, as over the course of time here, you're going through a whole, the late 50s, early 60s into this point. You have the Cold War having some various flashes along the way. I mean, you have the Berlin Wall going up, you have the Bay of Pigs. You also have stuff getting increasingly interesting in Southeast Asia. And how much were you aware of any of that stuff, say, up through 1965?
Oh, I was very aware of it, very aware of it, and very aware that I might potentially be involved in it. In fact, kind of upset that I was spending so much time away from being at sea and away from things that would really qualify me for higher responsibility in sea commands, because the Navy's about going to sea.
Right.
It's not about pushing paper, although sometimes people may wonder. And while I was at Ohio State, I received word from the Bureau of Naval Reactors, the Naval Reactors Division, I think it was called, in Washington, that I was going to be ordered there for to interview with Admiral Rickover for assignment and training in the nuclear power program. And that would have been another big chunk out of my operational career. So I was not happy about that. But I was fortunate. He decided not to interrupt the fact that I was already in getting a degree in something that vaguely related to my future duties if I were selected. So he let me complete my degree. Some of my contemporaries were not so fortunate. Some of them got pulled out of postgraduate school in Monterey and sent directly into the program. So I went to, these orders came to me while I was on leave between duty assignments, and I was off on an island off from the Keweenaw Peninsula with my father fishing, and the telegram came to my wife. She decided, well, she couldn't reach me anyway, but she decided she wouldn't interrupt my leave. So I came back, and here it was, proceed to Washington for an interview, and so I went. We were first debriefed, or briefed rather, by the people from the Chief of Naval Personnel, who said, number one, they didn't like this process at all, that they felt that they were responsible for assigning officers and not Admiral Rickover, and they made that very clear to us, but they said their hands were tied and that we should not bother to submit our resignations if we were selected because they wouldn't be accepted. And off we went to be interviewed. That proved out also not to be true. Some of them did submit resignations and they were allowed to resign, because why wouldn't they be allowed to resign? What kind of naval officers would they make under the circumstances? So I went and I was interviewed, and I had the classic Admiral Rickover interview.
Okay. Now, the current generation is not going to know very much about Admiral Rickover, so tell us a little bit, who was he and what was a classic Rickover interview?
Well, let me first say for those folks that if they really want to know about him and what those interviews were like, PBS has a DVD called Rickover, which I've just ordered. I have not looked at it yet, but it will tell you all about it. He's a man of incredible individual traits that you would hear many, many stories about them, and none of them would be embellished because no embellishment was ever required. My interview went, I was escorted in after two other submariners had been escorted out and told to go sit in what was called the penalty box because they would be called in for further interview because they had failed the initial part of the interview with him. He was very unhappy with submariners who did not, because he was principally looking for submarine nuclear power candidates because they were having a hard time manning, and both the officer and enlisted level, the numbers of people required for the nuclear submarine shipbuilding program. But they also needed some people for the three nuclear surface ships, one of them being Enterprise, the other Truxton, and Bainbridge. So I went in, I was too senior to go to a submarine for training. I'd have been senior to the officers training me, and that makes a real problem on board ship. So he asked me about my experience at University of Michigan on NROTC instructor duty. Did you take any courses? Said he. He had expected that my response would be, yes, I worked on advanced engineering courses. Instead, I told him I took a degree in psychology in the area of leadership. He didn't like that at all. Well, why didn't you take any courses? I said, because I was a bachelor and I was interested in other things, I said to him, point blank. I thought surely that would get me disqualified. But we completed the interview. It went kind of downhill. He asked me, where did I stand in my class? And I said, well, I don't know. They didn't publish class standings. You know where you stood in your class, said he. I said, I really don't, Admiral. I said, but somewhere I suppose in the top 5%. And then he hummed and hawed and said, okay, the interview's over, and sent me out of the room. The secretary magically popped up. He must have had a button somewhere he could push telling her to come in. She took me out of the room, and I don't know what the signal was, but she said, you've been selected.
Okay, we got in your story to the point where you had gotten through your interview with Admiral Rickover and were now in his program. And so, and now you get sent off for training. So where do you go and what do you do?
Well, I went to Bainbridge in Maryland, the Naval Training Center, which was on the skids at the time. It was downsizing on a regular basis, but the nuclear power training school was there. I believe it's in Orlando, Florida now. And we went to school 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, and we were expected to be studying on weekends. And I, generally speaking, was not studying on weekends. But Admiral Rickover kept close tabs. I remember some Navy enlisted folks made the headlines in the local newspaper for rescuing some people on the Snake River whose canoe tipped over. They were local heroes. And apparently Admiral Rickover read the local newspapers and he dinged the school, wanted to know why those kids were out doing that when they should have been studying. So anyway, I was now with people who were really, really bright folks. As a matter of fact, one of my classmates, Jack Cook, John Cook III, wanted, his sole goal was to become commanding officer of an attack submarine, and that's why he enrolled in the program. And when he breezed through it, he breezed through everything. He got his command. When his command was over, he retired from the Navy and went to medical school, and later on told me he found medical school very boring and very unchallenging. Those kind of people.
Well, if you're doing the nuclear school, I mean, you're getting a fair amount of physics along with the engineering,
and chemistry,
yeah,
and metallurgy and everything that might relate to safely operating a nuclear power plant. in terms of knowing fundamentally what you ought not to be doing and why the procedures might be what they are, so that you don't try to make any shortcuts. In other words, it's slow increase in temperature of the pressure vessel before you bring it up to full pressure, the slow cooling down of the pressure vessel before you bring it down to standby temperature. Those are things you don't want to test, and for very good reason, and those very good reasons are what we learned in the schoolhouse, as we called it.
All right. Now you do this for 6 months,
Right.
and now what comes next?
Then we were off to 3 different reactor sites that you could go to. One for destroyers, one for submarines, and one for the aircraft carrier and the cruiser, the Long Beach. We had no choice of which one, because a lot of it had to do with their ability to take on student load. And I was sent out to Idaho Falls, Idaho, to the prototype reactors for Long Beach and Enterprise, which is where I ultimately ended up. After I was trained, I ended up in Enterprise. The reactors there, they had 2 reactors, the A1W and the A2W. They were parallel reactors. One was being developed and it was under construction, but you could train on it and qualify on it. Or if you wanted, we had the option of getting a single reactor qualification, qualifying only on the A1W reactor. I chose to qualify on both of them. The routine there was you went out, it was a 50-mile run from Idaho Falls out to the reactor site out in the middle of the desert. We went out on a Navy chartered bus. We always wore civilian clothes until we got to the site, and then we got into uniform. We all had lockers. There was a great, huge Quonset hut, at the end of which there was one kind of a bedroom kind of place, a stateroom, if you Navy terms, and the rest of it was all an open dormitory with bunk beds in it, where most of the officers were. There was one senior officer's room, as I mentioned, and that was occupied by Kenneth Wallace, who was a captain in the Navy, headed to be commanding officer of USS Long Beach. The classes overlapped. There was a class 3 months into their training, and then when we came in, and then there would be another class in 3 months coming in during our last 3 months of training. When Ken Wallace left his stateroom, I being the senior officer there, I got to get out of the bunk room and go in, and I had a little radio in there so I could have a little going to sleep music and so forth, and that made my life considerably more pleasurable for the final 3 months.
So how would you be out there? Were you out there the full 3 months or 6 months, or did you go back and forth Idaho Falls?
We would load up a lunch bucket with as many sandwiches as we could cram into it. There were some vending machines where you could get some beverages and coffee principally, but I think hot chocolate and soft drinks. So we would take enough food out there to stay several days, usually at least 3, and then we'd come home and load up the lunch bucket and go back out again. And in the meantime, while we were out there, we double shifted. We'd be in the hull for 8 hours, and then we'd spend another 8 hours on our own, and then sleep the remaining 8 hours. So I didn't listen to my radio a whole lot. And you had to pass what were called practical factors, and they were subsystems of the total propulsion system and reactor systems. And so you had to train on knowledge of the reactors and all of the piping. You had to dive down into the bilges and find all of the pipes that ran through the bilges and everything from top to bottom. You needed to know, and then you had what was called a practical factors exam, and some senior person, frequently an enlisted man, would grill you on what you had learned, and if you didn't pass, well, then you got to do it some more. And then when you completed, it was an individual thing. When you signed off on all your practical factors, you got to take the final exam, and if you passed that, then they put you on watch as a regular officer, because it was an operating nuclear power plant. The power all went to driving a big steam generating water column. Most of the energy was dissipated as steam into the air. Totally isolated, however, from any of the nuclear material, because that was in a separate envelope, totally separate from the steam generating aspects. In other words, it was a hot water steam generating plant.
Okay. Now, in that era, how much attention did they pay to things like exposure to radiation or anything else like that?
We all wore radiation badges. They had a bit of a panic once when we were at Bainbridge. All of our dosimeters showed up that we'd maxed out for the quarter, and it was obviously something went wrong somewhere. It would be too much of a coincidence for us all to have received the same exposure. But they did monitor us very carefully.
Mm-hmm.
The nuclear risk down in the power plant was less than that from cosmic radiation up on the flight deck of the Enterprise.
All right. Now, what is your wife doing as you're going? Do you keep bouncing around while does she just follow you around from one place to the next?
She did. She taught in many places. She taught in Charleston, as I think I already mentioned. She taught in a number of other places. She taught in Pacific Grove when I was in Monterey. She taught in Maryland, in the same school system at the same time in the second grade. Cal Ripken was in the second grade, but not in the same schoolhouse. But other than that, she could have been teaching him. But eventually she priced herself out of the job market in teaching because, as you know, teacher unions invoke certain things in the contract relative to what people have to be compensated relative to years of experience and their education level, and they typically couldn't hire her as an entry-level teacher anymore, even if she had been willing to accept what she would have been willing to do just for the love of teaching. She loved to teach. But eventually she couldn't do that anymore, so. But a lot of my career she did teach, and the rest of the time she taught in well, we haven't gotten there yet, but when I was aboard Enterprise, she taught in Oakland, California.
Okay. Well, it looks like Enterprise is about the next step.
Yes, that's where we're headed.
Okay. And
I got orders to Enterprise. And I was not happy, of course, because there is nothing beyond Enterprise in terms of a surface warfare officer, in terms of your experience and how it might apply to some other ship type. There was no other ship type. So with that kind of a nuclear power plant, other than, of course, the Long Beach, and Long Beach's lifetime was not really all that long. So I was ordered there as the main propulsion assistant, which meant I was responsible for all aspects of the main propulsion plant. It was a nuclear billet, but not in the reactor department, which also was entirely nuclear billets. We had both nuclear and non-nuclear billets in the engineering department. So that was a very, very challenging tour. Enterprise's standard plan of the day said the standard work day aboard Enterprise is 14 hours. I would have killed for a 14-hour day. I told myself early on, this isn't nuclear power, this is manpower, and a lot of it.
so what would you actually have to do? What's your job consist of?
Well, I had to stand a lot of watches. I had to supervise maintenance, and I had to train people, and I had to be trained. When I reported, I wasn't automatically qualified aboard Enterprise. Every time you changed duty stations in the nuclear power training program, you had to train and be qualified on that specific power plant. So I had to be trained, and that took most of my very first deployment. I think I was about 2/3 of the way through the deployment before they blessed me and said I could operate one of their power plants. And then from there, very rapidly, I qualified as engineer officer of the watch and engineering duty officer, and that was how I spent the rest of my tour.
Okay. And where was the Enterprise when you joined it?
It was in its home port. During the home port was Alameda and Oakland. During my 2 years aboard Enterprise, it spent exactly 28 days alongside the pier at its home port. Now, it did spend more time than that in San Francisco, but not a lot of the time, because the upkeep period between deployments was at the San Francisco Naval Shipyard. So we did spend quite a bit of time there. But Subic Bay in the Philippines proved to be much closer to being my home port than Enterprise ever was. Alameda ever was.
Okay, so where were the deployments?
To the South China Sea in the Gulf of Tonkin, on what was called Alpha Station. There were other stations in Enterprise off from Vietnam that aircraft carriers did serve in, but only in their earlier tours. And I was the second tour out there with Enterprise, so they were considered to be an experienced operating ship then.
Mhm.
So we went up to Station Alpha, which was the closest one up to the Vietnamese, North Vietnam.
Okay, so it's the farthest north of the
Right.
stations.
Mhm.
I mean, I had interviewed somebody who was on something called Yankee Station.
Yeah.
Was that?
Yankee Station. In fact, I misspoke myself. I should have called it Yankee Station.
Okay.
Alpha strikes are what we flew off of
All right.
Yankee Station. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
All right. And so this is now, is this 66 or 67 you're there, or?
I was 66 through 68. I was Port Enterprise. 1 8-month deployment and another 6-month deployment. The second one was shorter because Admiral, then Captain Holloway, intervened after he was relieved of command of the ship to shorten the third tour, because the third Enterprise tour would have been another 8-month deployment that encompassed Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's, Easter, the 4th of July. And he really felt that Enterprise deserved, if they were to maintain any morale aboard the ship, a break from that constant cycle.
Okay. And when you're, so how long would you actually spend on station? How long would you be off the coast of Vietnam before you went back to Subic Bay or someplace else?
We were out there usually for 30 days, and then we were in for not a long period of time, as I recall. It would vary. We did go to Hong Kong for a port visit a couple of times, so that was a nice break. And we went to Sasebo, which is another story I'll tell about a little later, for one visit. But if we went into Subic, we were there for logistics support. We went into for provisions and some repair items that the ship's force couldn't handle, although there weren't many of those. And then we were back out again.
Okay. So when you're on station, basically the aircraft are flying strikes over Vietnam, essentially, and that
Yes.
kind of thing.
Mhm.
And but you were mostly dealing with just with your particular duties, propulsion systems, and how much contact did you have with the people engaged in the air campaign, or how much attention did you pay to that?
Well, for one thing, one of the most dangerous workplaces in the world is the flight deck. So you just don't go up there unless you have business to be there.
Mhm.
And I would not have, it didn't take me much to discourage me from wanting to be on the flight deck. Although I did fly on and off the ship once on a what's called a carrier onboard delivery aircraft, which essentially flew off the deck,
Mhm.
not with a sans catapult, and landed sans resting gear, as I recall. I don't believe we used a resting gear even. But I knew that many of those people were not coming back, and I didn't want to get terribly emotionally involved with people I might have to worry a whole lot about and couldn't do anything about, and I had business to attend to. So, and most of the naval aviators kept to themselves, and most of them ate in the forward mess, not back in the
Mhm.
main officers' mess. For one thing, they could be a lot more relaxed, and they were among their brothers and so forth.
Right. So you kind of had your own kind of world or subculture, or whatever that you were part
Yeah,
of.
there was not a lot of mixing of the cultures.
All right. Did you have a sense of much of what was actually going on in Vietnam on the ground?
Yes, as a matter of fact, we had a Marine officer detachment on board. They were responsible for and of course the Navy never ever acknowledges whether nuclear weapons are anywhere. They neither confirm nor deny. But if there were nuclear weapons aboard Enterprise, there was a Marine Corps detachment on board whose responsibilities were to guard those nuclear weapons. And I remember that the officer in charge, who was a Marine Corps captain, requested and was granted permission to take some leave he had due, he was going to use it or lose it, to go in country in Vietnam and fight. That's how he took his leave. And then he came back to the ship.
All right. Now, were you on station when the Tet Offensive started in early '68, or were you someplace else?
That's a good question. Remind me when Tet was
It's like
exactly.
it begins about January 30th, 31st, 1968, and then so it's February is when a lot
Yeah,
of
that was
fighting
in
going on.
my final tour. Yes, so I was aboard, and I believe I was aware of Tet. We got daily news updates, so at a very superficial level, at the
Mhm.
drudge report level, we knew what was going on in Vietnam.
Now, did you ever go ashore in Vietnam, or did that not happen with?
No, that did not happen.
Okay.
I did fly over over Vietnam while the war was still going on.
What was the occasion for that?
Well, that was actually after that tour when I was on shore duty in the Philippines, and the wife and I both flew over Vietnam when the war was still going on. Shows you the confidence we had in our air superiority.
Right. Okay. Now, when you were at Subic Bay, Subic Bay is well known as
Yes.
a place that a lot of crew use for recreational purposes
Mhm.
and so forth. Did you have things to worry about or warn against? I mean, if we go land.
Well,
and sea,
yes,
good?
Longapo was the favored place to go on Liberty, the only place to go on Liberty, really. It's right outside the gate.
Mhm.
And that was a place sailors like to go, 24-hour operations going on all the time. Lots of young women, many of them were prostitutes.
Mhm.
Many sailors fell in love with those girls, and some of them wanted to marry them. If they chose to do that, then they had to get permission, and they had to be interviewed by their commanding officer, and they had to be interviewed by a chaplain, and they had to be warned and advised about what some of the pitfalls might be of such an arrangement.
Mhm.
And I actually, when I had my later tour at Subic as a commanding officer, I had to do that. Few of them were ever dissuaded, actually. The usual answer was, yeah, but she's in love with me,
Mhm.
was the usual response.
Yep. Okay. And were there issues? Were there health concerns, VD, things like that?
Oh, yes, well, of course, that didn't relate specifically to Subic. That's always been,
Yeah.
services have always had their VD movies and
Mhm.
so forth. The anonymity of a uniform and being away from home relaxes an awful lot of inhibitions in many people. So that's always a concern.
All right. Now and then when you went into Hong Kong, what was that experience like?
We did two things. We went sightseeing, three things. We went sightseeing, we had some great meals, and we went shopping, because shopping in Hong Kong was not to be topped anywhere. We had tailor-made uniforms made. We bought things to take home to spouses, and in some cases girlfriends, and mothers and
Mhm.
sisters. So we did that kind of thing. I remember going up to the border and looking into communist China, which was quite an interesting thing because it looked just like more property to me,
Mhm.
but it was indeed communist China. They had laws at that time requiring certificates of origin for everything you bought. It had to be proven that it did not come from communist China.
Mhm.
Certainly not a problem today.
No, definitely not. Okay. And you mentioned that Sasebo, Japan, that was an interesting place to visit for you.
Yes, because we went there at the beginning of the second deployment, my final deployment. And from there we were supposed to go to Singapore. And we were going to cross the line, which I viewed with mixed feelings because, of course, I relished the idea of having a certificate of having crossed the line.
As in the equator?
At the equator.
Yeah.
I didn't look forward quite so much to the initiation.
Mm-hmm.
A little trepidation toward that, but nevertheless, overall, I really was looking forward to going across the equator on going to Singapore. We were in Sasebo. When we arrived at Sasebo, we had to anchor out because there were no alongside facilities for a ship the size of Enterprise. As soon as we anchored, small boats, sampans and the like, began to circle the ship, and all the while we were there, they ran a circle around and around and around the ship. We were allowed to go to ashore on Liberty. There wasn't a whole lot we could do there, but we had a naval support base there. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons we went there was to prove that we could. The Navy was making a statement. The local people made their own statement that namely that we weren't all that welcome. So after the first day, tear gas began to appear on the scene as the local authorities became more and more concerned about safety and security. And I hadn't really planned to go ashore at Sasebo until I was told I couldn't. And then I decided, well, I don't, tear gas be damned, I'm going to go on liberty. So I did, and I had my first experience with tear gas since I had been in atomic, biological, and chemical warfare training as an ensign. And we went to a very nice restaurant. We had a nice meal there. But we departed, headed down toward Singapore. We were headed south. And
So at what point did you get tear gas exposure then?
when I was ashore in Sasebo.
But going to or from the restaurant or in the middle of it? Or?
As I recall, it was right after we landed. So it was before I went to the restaurant. It was really fairly late.
Right.
Most of it had dissipated.
Okay. So you're heading off to Singapore.
Mm-hmm. We hadn't been underway, and I don't think even a half a day, when we got a message to head for the Sea of Japan off of Korea, and the Pueblo had been captured. And the Joint Chiefs of Staff had apparently determined they needed to move forces before they even had a strategy meeting with the National Security Command and the President to decide what we were actually going to do about this. Well, that meeting happened that evening after we had already turned and gone up there, and we were, the next day we were there, and Lyndon Baines Johnson, when he heard that what the placement of the forces was, didn't like the idea that Enterprise was that exposed, because we were all very comfortable with the fact that we had air superiority everywhere we went. That was no longer true. They had an entire fairly capable Air Force, and in sheer numbers, we did not have air superiority. So he said he wanted Enterprise removed and gave that order to, I don't think he wanted the Enterprise removed altogether, but he wanted it further away from the range of their land-based aircraft. Next morning, when he got his morning sit report, it hadn't happened. The mythology aboard the ship, the word that went around, the rumors, the scuttlebutt as we called it in the Navy, was that he had gone ballistic when he found out his orders had not been carried out, and that he got on what we called on the horn. He got in radio communications directly with the ship, and he ordered the commanding officer directly turn south. That was what they said. I never have believed that, but on the other hand, we did turn south. So he told somebody to have us head south, but we never got to Singapore. We went back to Yankee Station.
Okay. Now, are there other events, things that took place in your time with the Enterprise that kind of stand out in your memory?
Well, we had a lot of, I wouldn't say we had a lot of incidents, but it's a large city, 5,500 men on board. There were not women yet.
Mm-hmm.
The 3,500 of those roughly were ship's company, and the rest were embarked air wing. A city that operates around the clock, and populated by an average population age that falls within the range of 18 to 21, 22. So if you were to magnify that demographic to a full-size city, you're talking about a big city in any terms. So we had lots of stuff that went on. We had some accidents that I won't describe, but sailors make mistakes and they have accidents. One particular bad one was a couple of sailors in the tire shop ignored the requirement to put a boot around a tire they were inflating, and it exploded and amputated both hands on one of the men, and that was a fairly gruesome thing. But the thing that struck me about Enterprise, different from any ship that I'd ever been on, they had a fire detail. They had a fire company on board, a sub-element of the damage control parties, that responded if the fire alarm went off. If the fire alarm went off, then the volunteer fire department went to the scene. And we had one of those every day. And I couldn't get used to that. I thought, a fire on board a ship every day? But think again, big ship, lots of moving parts, lots of people doing lots of things, and lots of hot liquids flowing, and lots of jet fire and so forth. And so yeah, it was an exciting tour.
What was morale like on the ship?
Excellent. We had two great commanding officers. J.L. Holloway, the third, was the first one. We called him Jimmy Triple Sticks. I don't know if you ever knew that or not.
Mhm.
But he became the chief of naval operations. He was selected for admiral during my first tour on board. A really, really great naval officer. And he was followed by Isham Linder, who was also he was followed by by Captain Kent. Name has slipped my mind. But anyway, he was also, they were very different naval officers. I learned how Kent Lee, Admiral Kent Lee, he became an admiral also, as many of the commanding officers of Enterprise did. Very different personalities, and I learned for the first time that the size of a ship does not diminish the fact that the personality of the commanding officer permeates the personality of the ship. They were very different, and the personalities of the ships were very different under those two commanding officers. But they were equally effective.
What was different about them?
Well, I wouldn't want to say some of the things that were different about them, but Admiral Holloway was a real sailor's officer. When we were in port, he visited all of the enlisted clubs, had a drink with the troops and so forth. He mingled very well. He's a very person-oriented person. Kent Lee was more austere, more formal. I think things were much more relaxed in the aviation part of the ship under Jim Holloway than they were under Kent Lee. But Kent Lee was an equally effective commanding officer. I don't want to be misunderstood about that. But they were very different, just like you and I are different.
Now, were the enlisted personnel largely enlistees as opposed to draftees because it's the Navy?
At that time, yes. And we had not yet had the race problems that came on in later years aboard aircraft carriers. So we did not have those problems yet.
All right. Okay. So you complete that assignment now in 1968, and what do you get next?
Well, I took the reactor safeguards exam for further assignment. The detailer for nuclear qualified officers wanted me as his relief, and he committed a no-no. He cut orders for me to be his relief before I actually went and took the safeguards test, and Admiral Rickover went orbital about that. So that did not happen, and I got sent instead to the Office of Naval Research because I owed them what's called a payback tour because they sponsored my billet and in the Advanced Science Program. So I spent 3 years in the Office of Naval Research.
And where was that based?
In Washington, D.C.
Okay.
The Chief of Naval Research's headquarters in what was called Old Main Navy.
Okay. And what did you actually do there?
I managed basically university research contracts at the Marine Physics Laboratory of Scripps Oceanographic Institute, at MIT, and under the Themis program, what was called the Themis program, which was a program designed by the Chief of Naval Research to bootstrap colleges that didn't have really strong engineering programs by infusion of research funds to raise their capabilities. I had a contract at the University of Massachusetts that I supervised.
All right.
That's what was called a technical contracting officer.
Okay. Did you enjoy the assignment, or did you want to?
Yes, I did. I learned a lot. Met some very outstanding research people, particularly out at Scripps Institute. Those folks are really top notch. They did a lot of and one of my office mates there in the Office of Naval Research had the Woods Holes contract, and he managed a contract under which a young Navy lieutenant was working there doing research, and his name was Robert Ballard.
Later famous as diver and
That's correct.
salvage expert.
So yes, it was an outstanding experience, but once again, out of the mainstream. By this time, I was far afield of the career path for anyone who was going to
Yeah. What rank
rise in the
yeah.
Navy.
What rank were you at this point?
I made commander while I was there.
Okay. All right. And of course, your
But
wife.
making commit captain at that point in time seemed very slim.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And well, at least your wife got to stay in one place for 3 years.
Yes, she did. And she got very involved in the Officers' Wives Club for the Office of Naval Research. She had me do the artwork for their cookbook, and we got into the theater. We got into the Kennedy Center, doing lots of cultural things that we hadn't had the opportunity to do before.
All right. And anything else that kind of stands out about that particular tour in terms of what you wound up accomplishing or remember about it?
No, I don't really think so, except that while I was there, they were in the business of developing, and I was on the periphery of it, and it was not in our specific office, but I knew that ongoing was a project in cooperation with ARPA to develop a network which would allow universities to exchange data in real time, and it became the internet.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to tell you that at the time, Al Gore was in college and had nothing to do with creating the internet. I know for a fact.
All right.
That's the only political thing I'll say.
Okay. So you do that for 3 years. Now you made it in 1971. And so where do you go next if you've got such an odd career trajectory now?
Well, while I was there, I received a call from the detailer. And he said he was working on my next assignment, and I had no idea what it might be at this point. I had the same question you just had. Where in the world are they going to send me from here? I thought I was probably going to retire. That's what I probably thought was probably going to happen. I'd have one more no-account tour, and I'd be gone. He said, I got a command equivalent to command at sea available that we need somebody with your background for. Well, that was a lie.
Mm-hmm.
Twofold. Number one, yes, there were billets called equivalent to command at sea, destroyer command at sea, but I knew that was a facade. That couldn't possibly be true. You couldn't do something ashore that would qualify you in the same way that a destroyer command tour would. So that I knew that was mythology. And the other one was that I was particularly skilled, had the skill set necessary. That was the other part. So I bid. I said, well, what is it? He said, well, I can't tell you. And I said, well, I can't make a decision if you can't tell me. And he said, well, it's in Westpac, and it's a shore base in the Western Pacific, and I can't tell you more than that. But it's overseas. And I said, well, am I going to be able to take my family? And he said, yeah, it's an accompanied tour. They may not be able to accompany you immediately, but they'll be able to follow you out there. I said, let me go home and talk it over with my wife. So I did, and my mother-in-law was visiting at the time. And she said, well, that sounds like a career opportunity to me. You ought to take that. You ought to do that, she said. I don't think Nancy was all that keen about it, but I went back and I said, okay. I said, we had just adopted our son. He was, at that point in time, about 7 months old, I think. And so I got back on the phone with him and I said, well, wife says it's a go. I said, so I suppose I need a little time. I said, otherwise I'm going to have to burn the house to the ground. I'm going to have to shoot the dog and give the kid back to the adoptive agency. So he gave me, I think, about a month to finalize the adoption, which they expedited for me. Make arrangements to have the dog shipped out to us later, and for Nancy to find a place, namely the family cottage here in Bayview in Michigan, to spend part of the summer while I flew out and took over duties. It turned out to be commanding officer of the Naval Magazine, which has nothing to do with life or time. It has to do with storing, distributing, receiving, refurbishing, and other things related to weapons and munitions.
And where was it?
And it was in the Philippines, in Subic Bay, up at QB Point. It was called Naval Magazine Subic, but it was actually up at QB Point, up at the naval aviation part of the Navy base.
Okay. Now, once they told you that you could have family along, did you figure out you weren't going to Vietnam?
Yeah, I was fairly certain of that. There were no accompanying tours to Vietnam as far as I knew. I think actually there were a couple, but they would be rare. So anyway, yeah, and well, they cut me orders, and of course, when I got the orders, I knew where I was going.
Right.
And so we packed up, and that is when things were really turning hot back here in the United States, both in terms of anti-war protesting and in terms of racial unrest. When we went to get our immunizations for this tour overseas, we had to go from where we were living in Virginia, down in Springfield, Virginia, across the Arlington Memorial Bridge to something called the Potomac Annex of the Navy Medical Center to get our immunizations. And when we crossed the bridge, there were gun emplacements, machine gun emplacements on the bridge, and they were also on the steps of the Capitol building. People today have no idea what that time was really, really like. And in fact, while we were going back just a little bit aboard Enterprise, when we were in port and I had the duty on the weekend, I sometimes invited Nancy out to the ship on Sunday if I had the duty for Sunday dinner aboard ship. She had to come out by motor launch, officer's motor launch, rather than driving over to the shipyard because the snipers up in the apartment buildings in the what did we call them, the big
Like housing projects?
the projects, that's the word I was driving for, were firing at the Marines at the entry points into the naval base, into the naval shipyard.
It's not something you hear about either.
They never hit any of them, so I don't think they were trying to. But I didn't want my wife driving there, so she came over in the motor launch. So that tempo would even increase by this time, and it was really. So I wasn't all that happy about leaving the country, and off we went to Subic. We had a niece that was due to arrive in July, and I had to report in June, so I went out a month ahead of time, and Nancy went north to await the arrival of this new niece, and with our then 8-month-old son, and at 9 months she flew out with him on a charter transport to Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines and joined me.
All right. And so now describe a little bit what that tour was like.
That was a very challenging tour. It was 3 years long. It was nominally a 2-year tour. The end of the second year coincided with the end of the shooting war in Vietnam, not the end of the war, but the end of the
American part.
Right. The prisoners of war came back. And so then the magazine went into downturn mode. Now, during the 2 years first part, I could get anything I wanted. They ordered people in from other stations out in Westpac. They ordered equipment in from the East Coast and deprived whoever needed it back there, sent it out to Westpac, mostly certified ammunition handling equipment, what we called yellow gear. So I had everything I wanted to fight the war. Now it was all going to go away, and oh, by the way, they were going to downgrade the people available to me to make it happen faster than the stuff was going to go away, and there was going to be a big backlog of work and not enough people to do it and not enough money to do it. And I wanted to see for myself whether or not I could manage that environment as well as when I had everything I needed. So I asked for a 1-year extension, and I got it. I'm sure they were all too glad to give it to me, because I figured I wasn't going to make captain at that point in time anyway. And we were ensconced, we were enjoying life out there. We had a live-in maid, we had a live-in ama for our son. We had a yard boy who came every day and polished the brass until there was hardly anything left of it, mowed the lawn. We were living the life of expatriates abroad for 3 years. It was like being a king, but there was a war to be fought, and there was a lot of excitement relative to that, mostly having to do with the mining campaign, because we prepared all the mines that went into the harbors up in North Vietnam.
Yeah, so Haiphong, when they were mining Haiphong Harbor.
On Easter Sunday morning, I was in the chapel at QB Point, and a messenger from the magazine came down the aisle and tapped me on the shoulder and said, "You're needed at the magazine immediately." So I left wife, left son, went to the magazine, and we had orders to prepare an incredible number of mines because they were about ready to start the mining campaign. So we had those kind of things going on. We had a tremendous number of ships. We had one of the worst rainstorms in the history of the Philippines. It rained day and night for 103 days, an average of 3 inches every day.
Wow.
Washed the road out on the way up to QB. Water everywhere, and never a drop to drink. They had to bring what they called water buffaloes, with their big tankers up to provide us with water. The maids would go up, draw water out of the water buffalo, and bring it back down to the quarters. And we had 3 typhoons that came through, one on top of the other, and then when they got to the the east side of the island, Luzon, they all stalled and just made a terrific superstorm. Dumped all that water, and during that, by coincidence, during that 103 inches of, or 103 days of rain, we moved 103,000 tons of ordnance.
So I guess in 71, particularly in 72, when the Easter Offensive broke out, we were supplying a massive amount of air and naval support still. Far fewer American ground troops there, but you guys would have been busy.
We really were busy. I had an interaction, by the way, with an Air Force officer who called relative to the unpleasantness in Cambodia. The Air Force was out of 500-pound bombs, and he wanted to borrow some from me. So he called the commanding officer of Naval Magazine, see if he could borrow some of our 500-pound bombs with a promise to pay him back. I said, well, number one, I'm not authorized to provide you with bombs. I'm not able to issue them between services just because I think it's a good idea. And I said, number two, I don't think it's a good idea because you're unable to return us in kind, because we do use different kind of bombs, 500-pound bombs, than you do. Ours have to be able to withstand a conflagration on board a ship before they cook off, so they have an entirely different skin to them. And he said, he got very angry with me. Finally he said, don't you understand this is the only war we have? And I said, couldn't care less, call my boss. So people view their responsibilities in different ways.
Okay. Now, how did that last year go? You said you took it on as just a challenge. What the heck? Let's do it. Did you manage that whole downsizing thing, or?
Well, it was still there until the Mount Pinatubo blew up many years later. So yeah, I think we did quite well. I got a medal. The base received a commendation.
All right, and now that comes to an end in 74. And what do you get next?
Well, I had screened, because of my nuclear power training, for a job ashore in engineering, in ship engineering. But because I was at an ordnance station, the detailer in his great wisdom decided I knew a lot about ordnance, so I ought to go to the Naval Ordnance Laboratory, which 1 week after I arrived actually turned out no longer to be the Naval Ordnance Laboratory. It turned out to be the Naval Surface Weapons Center. But other than storing them, receiving them, renovating them, I didn't know all that much about weapons. That had not been my shipboard experience at all. But that's where I went and why I went. And by the way, I went out to the Philippines to begin with. My skill set that matched was they needed somebody who knew something about ordnance, and in particular a background in chemistry would do. And since I had a background in physical chemistry, that was probably close enough. I'm sorry, it was a background in physics. That's what they were
physics,
looking for.
physical chemistry.
Since I had a degree in physical, that was probably close enough. Was their considered opinion.
All right. So now, where was the Naval Surface Weapons Center?
I was in White Oak, Maryland, and we bought a house nearby in Calverton. And once again, I stashed the wife and the child for the summer with her folks, and they enjoyed it summer in Michigan, while I went house hunting. And when I found something that I thought she might approve of, well, then I called her and had her come out, and we looked at the results of the fruits of my search, and we bought a house in Calverton, Maryland. We were there for a year, and then quarters became available on the grounds of the Weapons Center, where I could walk to work, and that was just super. couldn't turn that down, so we kept the house and rented it out, and we moved into government quarters. Government quarters that were actually designed for a flag officer at the time. I had a button right beside my bunk that I could push to call the steward to come to the bedroom for whatever I might need. I pushed that button many times, nobody ever came. There were no more stewards in flag quarters by that time. But it was a beautiful house, we loved living in it.
Okay, and then what were you actually doing?
Well, there was no real job there, so I thought maybe I ought to create a job. They had things called Ordnance Applications Officer, and we were to be available to department heads. It was almost entirely civilian research organization, populated heavily with PhDs, hardly anybody with less than a master's degree, and us. And if they had a question about how whatever their grand idea was might be applied to a Navy application, then we were there to be called upon. That's why we were called Ordnance Application Officers. We were rarely ever called upon. And practically everyone who was ever assigned there got passed over and went on to civilian life at the end of their tour there. Well, I wasn't quite ready to retire yet, and I certainly wasn't ready to sit around for 2 years in an office waiting for a call that would never come. So I decided to go out on my own and find things to do. And I convinced the commanding officer that the organization was stovepiped, as we used to say. The sponsors downtown for the various and sundry research projects infused their project money directly into the organization, not necessarily involving the commanding officer in any way. So he didn't have a whole lot of control over the funding that came in that kept his organization going and viable and so forth. So I convinced the commanding officer that he really ought to have some oversight of these projects. If he didn't have anything to do with where the money came from, at least he could see how they're going, kick the tires, as it were. So he said, well, have at it, set up a process for doing project reviews. So I did, and I thought it was a very safe process that I set up, where there would be a format for things that would be of importance to him to know. Who were the funding, who were the sponsors, what were the funding levels, what were the out-year projections and so forth, what was the status of the project, how far were they from finishing something and moving on to the next, and oh, by the way, what did they have to move on to next, that kind of stuff. Well, we held our first project review. I picked the very best project I thought, the solidest project that I thought existed, and it was a disaster, and the guy got fired. I felt very, very badly about it. But we tinkered with it, and everybody learned a lot, and it got put in place, and it continued, the process did, and I think things improved considerably. Anyway, in the course of all that, I got passed over for captain, as they say. The selection board that I would normally have been promoted in met, convened, and I was not on the list to be promoted. Did not surprise me, but I certainly was disappointed because I wasn't ready for my career to end. I had one more cycle I could go through. The commanding officer called me in and he said, this is the point where we have to talk about your future. He said, do you want to stay here and retire? Do you want to stay here and maybe you'll get selected? That would be like being struck by lightning. Or would you like to go have a get well tour, as it was called, which would be to go somewhere else and do something different, but not necessarily a career-enhancing assignment. Well, of the two of us that were in that category, one chose to leave for a get well tour. And I said to him, I'm going to stay here because this is where the Navy, in all their wisdom, said I needed to be, and I'm going to do the best job I can, and that's that. I either make it or I don't make it. Fully expecting I was not going to make it. I got selected. And the other guy did not. And he went to a miserable place called Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, populated entirely by supply officers. He being the only non-supply officer in the organization. Hardly a get-well tour, but the best thing that the detailers had to offer him.
Okay, so what did you get?
Well, I got something very good. Remember my first XO, Wayne Eugene Meyer? he asked me to come down and join him in his, what they called laughingly at the Naval Sea Systems Command, the people that liked to deride his efforts, called his Committee of Captains. And I was going to be the Weapons Systems Acquisition Manager. So I went down and joined the Aegis Shipbuilding Project at its creation. I was the very first person in that assignment. And I bought the weapons system for the suite that were up at the development site up in New Jersey. And also the suite for the very first ship.
Okay, and can you describe what an Aegis ship was or is?
Well, an Aegis ship is what's creating all the excitement now in the fleet. It's a ship capable of handling many targets simultaneously, engage many targets simultaneously, has a phased array radar with a very agile system, which makes it very hard to direct countermeasures against. And unlike the World War II ships, where one system acquired the target, another system picked the acquired target up and put it into a engagement mode, and then when it was ready, engaged, then it was passed over to a fire control mode, and finally the guns got to fire on the target. This system was fully integrated and did all those things and did it in really rapid order, as only computers can do.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and is this controlling weapons that are on this particular ship? Or,
yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so are these, in terms of size, I mean, these destroyer sized or?
The first ships were going to be cruisers.
Mm-hmm.
We were looking at the possibility of putting the radar system only aboard aircraft carriers.
Mm-hmm.
We were looking about at putting a grander version of it in cruisers.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the first ship turned out to have so much capability that the Navy decided it couldn't be a destroyer. So the ship we developed to be a destroyer became a cruiser.
Mm-hmm.
And then we developed another, not much less capable series of ships, class of ships that were destroyers,
Mm-hmm.
and they are now the large part of the population of the destroyer fleet. There are still Aegis cruisers as well. Mm-hmm. And they're capable of anti-missile defense in addition to engaging missile attacks. So it's a very capable system. It was a marvelous experience, and so I got to, I was what flag officers tended to call their ensigns, the first ensign that ever reported to them. Mm-hmm. Well, I was Wayne Meyer's ensign for his entire career, mm-hmm. and he called me ensign to the very end.
All right. And then where were you based?
So I think I may have confused things a little bit. I may have used the word missile twice. Air-to-surface missiles, they could engage multiple threats mm-hmm. simultaneously, but also incoming land-based missiles as well. They can engage.
Mm-hmm. All right. And then where were you based at this time? Was it New Jersey or somewhere else?
In Washington, D.C. at Naval Sea Systems Command.
All right. And then you did that for, what, 2 years to 79?
2 years. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then you're still in the Navy, so
yes.
what do they give you next?
Well, then he called me into his office one day and said they need a commanding officer at the Naval Weapons Station in New Jersey, Weapons Station Earle. And it looks to me as if you're qualified. This is the first time I had, other than Commander Banfield back mm-hmm. at the NROTC, ever was directly involved in my detailing. And I said, well, yes, I said that's, except that it's bigger and has some peripheral aspects to it, like housing and Navy exchange mm-hmm. and other kinds of dispensary for on-station medical care and so forth. Pretty much the same command I had out in the Philippines. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I would think I'd be able to handle that assignment. So that's what happened.
All right. Now, where in New Jersey is that?
It is right near Sandy Hook.
Okay, so
there's a piece of New Jersey that juts out into New York Harbor, mm-hmm. and you can actually see the Verrazano Bridge from mm-hmm. Weapons Station Earle. It's that close. It had its uniqueness was it had some it had a very long pier. It was 3 miles long. The idea was it could be out in the middle of the good standoff distance from populated areas. If anything untoward happened and the ship exploded, there would be no civilian casualties other than civilian employees of the station who might happen to actually be aboard the ship. When I reported there, they were getting ready to move ammunition ships up there to Homeport, and that was going to be a major expansion of the station. Huge. I hadn't been there 1 week before Harry Train, the commander of the Atlantic Fleet, came up to kick the tires and find out whether he really wanted his ships to come up to this remote location from where they were. But it was really unsafe for them to be down where they were. And they were in a highly populated area. And they were not within the safety arcs that were mandated by the ordnance regulations for such operations. They really had to do something. Long before I got there, it turned out that a destroyer escort named Solars came alongside, and during lunch hour, the crew was handling something called hedgehogs. They were anti-submarine kind of torpedo-like missiles that you fired out of a spigot off the bow of the ship, and they made a circular array when they went down, and they would explode at a predetermined depth and hopefully kill a submarine. That was their purpose. Well, they were moving these hedgehog, the munitions themselves, because they were loading the ship, and a sailor up on the top deck dropped one, and it went all the way to the keel, and it exploded. A low order explosion, but it generated enough heat to cook off other explosives nearby, which generated more heat, and eventually the forward end of the ship, the bow of the ship, peeled back in an explosion like a sardine can, literally. It looked like a sardine can. Peeled up and went right over the bridge. And when I arrived at Weapons Station Earle many years later, the 3-mile pier was only 1 mile long, and they were working on a project to build 2 more piers that would be 3 miles long. And that was all part of this big project that was ongoing when I arrived there.
So did they indeed go and move the ammunition storage there? And
It was never a major storage facility. It was used primarily for staging to load ships, and also to download ships that had to go into a shipyard and needed to have offload their munitions, but it was not a major. But during World War II it was, and as a matter of fact, from the inland area where the storage areas were, and where the administrative areas and so forth, and the housekeeping facilities were, there was a road that went, as I recall, it was 13 miles long, something like that, maybe 17 miles. Anyway, it ran from the main station down to the waterfront facilities. It was named Normandy Road because that's where the munitions for Normandy went from the U.S. to the European theater in World War II.
all right. Now we were talking about your time at Naval Weapons Station Earle in northern New Jersey, and you're there 79 to 82. Now that's not very far from New York City. Now, but on the other hand, did it really feel like you were on a different planet because of the corner of New Jersey you were in, or?
Well, New Jersey is a different planet, but New Jersey is also much different than I expected New Jersey to be. It really is the Garden State, which is what they call themselves. Most people only know New Jersey as an impediment to getting into New York City. The rest of New Jersey isn't like that at all. I found it a very welcoming place. The Navy League was very active and very supportive. Got to know some very nice people. I had an employee actually who had been a Rockette in her earlier days, and we made many excursions into New York City. Nancy and I did, and we saw many things on Broadway. We saw Mickey Rooney and Sugar Babies, or whatever it was called. And we saw Annie in its second cast. We missed Jessica Parker by one person. I mean, within a couple of weeks she was gone, and Sarah Jessica Parker. That's what I'm trying to think of. So we just missed her, but we did see Annie on Broadway, and we saw a lot of other shows too. We went to Tavern on the Green, and we went to the museums and did all the things tourists do. Went to the top of the Twin Towers.
Yeah, well, they're still there.
Went to the Statue of Liberty.
All right. And now by this time we've gotten to kind of the post-Vietnam era and so forth. You get up in the late 70s before Reagan's elected and so forth. I guess Reagan's elected in 80, because of 81, but so kind of while you're there, was there a kind of post-Vietnam aftershock or ripple effect in the Navy in terms of people's attitudes toward it or careers in it, or did that not really register with you?
I don't think it had much impact on me personally,
Mm-hmm.
but I've always been a news hound, so to me, news just happens and kind of rolls along, and the world passes through phases, and some of them sound very familiar to previous phases, and so I probably didn't get as excited about all these things as others, but however, I know exactly where I was when Kennedy was assassinated.
Mm-hmm.
I was on the steps waiting to go into the auditorium to take my first organic chemistry exam, on which I scored a roaring 43,
Mm-hmm.
and they threw it out. So we recently had a to-do about, was it Harvard Law School that decided that it was going to be too traumatic to their students to take a law exam, and so they canceled it or threw it out. There's precedent for that.
Mm-hmm.
As I said, history does indeed repeat, and people forget that, there have been other times when other people made the same decisions.
Okay. And I guess I know that in the Army there was a lot of downsizing, including removing or demoting large numbers of officers. So people who made captain in a certain period became sergeants and things like that. Did the Navy have some version of that in the 70s?
No, I'd like to say that the Navy had much better personnel management, but they had fewer people to manage as well. So I have to give the Army that. They had a much bigger problem. So we didn't have people who were officers one day and going to the officers club, and the next day they couldn't go through the door. We did not have that happening by and large.
Did you have a lot of people though who maybe got moved toward retirement a little bit earlier than they would have otherwise?
Only because they would make the decision themselves, because they saw that the prospects for promotion were not going to be there, and but no, I didn't see many people actually forced out.
Okay. Now, your part, you had an 82, you got to complete the Naval Weapons Station assignment. You have one more assignment left in your career. What's the last thing you do?
Well, this time I asked for a specific assignment. The first time I asked for a specific assignment myself, and I asked to go to back to the Washington D.C. area, where we were still renting out our house, because we had government quarters up at Weapons Station Earle. And also so that our son could go to the Montgomery County schools, which were very good schools. So I asked if I could have the job, because I knew it was coming due, at the Johns Hopkins University laboratory in suburban Maryland, the Applied Physics Laboratory. And I got the tour, I got the assignment, and that's where I went. Navy put me through Administrative Contracting Officers School out at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, because the Air Force was known for their ability to manage large projects. I didn't have any need for such. I didn't have to worry about that. There were not those kinds of projects going on at APL at all. But in any event, I went to, so I had a tour on scene, very much like the tour that I had at a distance at ONR when I was involved with the Marine Physics Laboratory at Scripps Institute. And so I once again met a lot of fine research people. Where some of their things are just happening now that they were working on then.
Okay.
The thing that amazed me about the research business when I was in the Navy at the Office of Naval Research was the ability of the bureaucracy. I don't care what bureaucracy we're talking about. In this case, I'm talking about the Office of Naval Research and their sponsors to create crises if there is none going on. So we always had what we called our Friday afternoon fire drill. Now, if you had a project in research, frequently you had to get resources from many different money sources, different sponsors. And every sponsor would want to review the project, but they would want to review it from their particular angle. I can't tell you how many times on a Friday afternoon we were called upon to prepare a brief and have it ready for Monday morning while the civil servants all went home for the weekend to satisfy some particular sponsor that, by golly, we were doing exactly what he wanted.
All right. And okay, so this is your last assignment. And basically, do you decide, okay, it's about time to retire, I'm closing in on 30 years, or how does that work?
Actually, I retired on the basis of a personal decision. I retired one year early. When I was up at Weapons Station Earle, I made a big point of the fact that we were there, even though we were a shore establishment. If there were no fleet, we wouldn't need to be there. And so I went on a program of trying to change the culture. Cultural change is very hard to affect. And one of the things that really bothered me was the concept of the main station, as they call the inland area, and the waterfront, as they call the other area. And the waterfront always got kind of second behind the inland area in terms of resources, particularly maintenance and so on and so forth, attention from the staff and that kind of thing. It's an assignment that I got much like, in another way, like the magazine assignment out in the Philippines. I was sent out as a fireman to put out a fire. My predecessor in both cases had an alcohol problem, and they needed to relieve him. So I didn't find that the station was anything like I thought it should be in terms of appearance in many ways, and particularly attitude. We had the change of command ceremony when I relieved out in front of the Officers Club up in the main station, as it was called. I decided when I was going to retire, when I was going to leave the station, because I decided two things. Number one, I was not going to retire there. I was tired of going to retirement ceremonies where the person retired from a significant position and immediately left the face of the earth as far as everyone was concerned. How important could his job have possibly been if overnight he could vanish? I didn't want that to happen. So I asked for this additional tour for both that reason and selfish reasons. I made up my mind two things. Number one, first improve the appearance of the station, because if you don't work in a place that you can take pride in, you're not going to have pride in where you work. Number one. And number two, I wanted to do away with this two-station concept. I wanted it to be one station with an inland area and a waterfront area. So I decreed that to be. I spent 3 years trying to change the culture and the language so they would quit talking about the main station. When it came time to be relieved and have a change of command ceremony, I decided it wasn't going to be in front of the Officers Club this time. It was going to be at the waterfront. So I told the staff that's what I wanted, make it happen. They did a really nice job. We had a policy at the time. There was a railroad station, never used, but there was a staff for it. We maintained the tracks and so forth, that the Navy was encouraging us to start using, just to maintain it and have it ready for use if we had an increased tempo of operation for some reason. So they thought it would be a great idea, one way to keep the sailors from straggling in, very unmilitary-like, in an area far removed from where they normally worked, and to make sure they had a chance to inspect them beforehand and that they were shipshape and ready to appear at a change of command ceremony. They would borrow a couple of railroad cars and use the railroad to transport the sailors from the inland area to the waterfront. So we did that. And we had to clean up the cars. They hadn't been used some time. They were Pullman cars, but they were usable. So we cleaned them all up. The sailors got on board. I had nothing to do with that because I had to go to the waterfront. enter in grand style, as the Navy is accustomed to doing. And when I got there, they were all lined up looking great. The railroad train was off to the side on a spur and everything hunky-dory. A year later, when I got to APL, I got a phone call from Naval Sea Systems Command headquarters, and they told me that they had some some charges to file against me. That they had an Inspector General anonymous complaint in the complaint box that I had misused funds to hold this ceremony at the waterfront. Now it was basically, I think, some civilians who were disgruntled because I did not give them paid leave to go over shopping at the local mall. I told them they could have liberal administrative leave, but they wouldn't have paid leave. Not too many civilians actually showed up. I guess they chose to work. In any event, I think some of them were very unhappy, and in particular, I think the fire department was unhappy because they had to cover this event very remote from their normal fire station. In any event, I said, well, I'll come down and get the orders down there. No, the admiral was adamant. This is a Navy captain, his assistant, his aide. The admiral was adamant that I will come and deliver them to you personally. So I said, fine. So he came out, gave me the orders, and I was charged with dereliction of duty and misappropriation of funds. Now I knew this was coming because my former executive officer had called and told me that they were doing an investigation up there. They never told me. And so as soon as I got these orders, I wrote a note off to Admiral Wayne Meyer, who is still around, and said, I'm very unhappy about this. I said, I understand that this is how we do things now, but it's not my Navy, and it's not the way I understand our democracy should work. That people should suddenly have to face orders and charges that have been accumulated and amassed for some period of time, unbeknownst to them, and all of a sudden they have to respond, and that disappeared. And so I went down. I got the charges, and a date for what was called a flag mast was conducted. Now, mast in the Navy is a non-judicial hearing, in which the commanding officer awards administrative punishment if it's warranted. I had to do that several times as a commanding officer, not an inordinate number of times. Anyway, I had to go down, stand in front of the admiral's desk, have the orders read, have the inspector general's person who conducted the investigation present what he thought was wrong, and when he was all done, the admiral said, "Charges dismissed." And I went back to my desk at APL and wrote out my retirement letter. And said essentially, it's been a grand ride. I enjoyed every minute of it, but I've decided I don't want to do any more time. I'm ready to go home.
Okay.
And that was that.
All right. So once you get out, now what do? Where do you go? Do you find other work? Or?
First thing I did was I gathered up our son and my wife and a niece who was about my son's age, and we took my retirement trip. It was at the time of the New Orleans Exposition, not called a World Fair. The exposition was designed to enhance the waterfront area down in New Orleans to make it commercially more viable and alive and functioning. And so we went down, and then we toured the South, and we went down to visit my parents who were retired in Florida, and we went to Disney World, and then we went back up to Bayview and spent the rest of the summer. And then when the summer was over, I put my application in at the Vitro Corporation, which was a defense contractor, Navy almost exclusively. Actually, I administered their contract also when I was up at APL, and I was determined that I would not use any of my contacts. I would just put an application into the personnel office. Went in for an interview, and that's where I worked for the next 10.5 years. Then I became a consultant with them for about 2.5 more years, and and then I was done.
Okay. And how did you wind up back here?
Came back for family. We were both from Michigan. We decided it was time to come home.
All right. So you kind of look back at this whole kind of like career in the Navy and so forth. I mean, I guess you address this in a lot of different ways, but I mean, how do you think that affected you, or what have you kind of taken out of it, or how did it shape you?
Well, I don't know what I would have been if I had not been in the Navy, so it's kind of hard to say.
Yeah.
But I think in every regard it was beneficial to me as a person.
And did you find that sort of the experience sort of helped you directly in the career you had afterward? I mean, that's the...
Well, I don't think Vitro would have hired me if I had no
Mhm.
Navy experience,
Yeah.
because they were working almost exclusively for the Navy under contract. So surely it helped me get the job. But I interviewed with a person I'd never met before,
Mhm.
whom I was going to go to work for, and I didn't seek out any particular position
Right.
at the. I had a counterpart who went in and asked for and got a vice presidency. But 3 years later, after he'd exhausted all his contacts and things hadn't worked out as well as they'd hoped, he was gone.
Mm-hmm.
And I decided I'd just see if I could live as a civilian.
Okay. And then a different question, other end, how do you think the Navy changed over the course of the time that you were in it? Because you're in for, including your training period over 30 years.
I think it improved, and then I think it backslid. And I would say today it's greatly improved over the Navy I left. The Navy, when I entered, was in a very low state of readiness and morale, particularly the destroyer force.
Mm-hmm.
We had just come through a Secretary of Defense named Johnson, who was very penurious and not at all a big fan of the military and the Navy in particular. I remember when I was aboard Meadowlark, going ashore down in Key West when we were down there on an assignment to a hardware store and buying a part because I didn't have it in our store system, out of pocket.
Mm-hmm.
And people did that in the Navy in those days. They wanted the ship to go, they had to do what they could do to make it go.
And did it get better with investment in the Vietnam era, or?
Oh, certainly did, but eventually we had to draft people in Vietnam, and you could see a great difference. But I'm actually a fan of the draft. I really think we do need a civilian military. We need a cadre of career officers, certainly, and career enlisted people. But I do believe that we would engage in far fewer adventures if everybody had skin in the game. Particularly the people who go to Washington.
Mm-hmm. Quite possible.
I will say, however, that very few of my contemporaries agree with me.
That's a subject that gets beyond it. I think so.
So it's a question of, do you want the very best military you can have, or do you want the very best country you can have, in my view?
Yeah. Kind of balance. And so, but you also suggested that it improved, it regressed after a while, and then it's gotten better today. I mean, did it regress with?
Regressed because of the very, very long time that Vietnam ground on and on and on. And the enthusiasm in the public went down and down and down.
Mm-hmm.
And I came to the conclusion myself, when it was all over, said and done, that there were an awful lot of people who I, at the time, thought were terribly misdirected, were actually largely correct.
In terms of whether that was a war worth fighting? Or...
That was the war that we needed to fight.
Mm-hmm. And then in the modern era, sort of post 9/11.
But we don't know, you know.
Yeah.
We don't know. I mean, we did fight the war.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know what would have happened if we had not fought the war.
That's true.
Or if we had fought a different war than the war we fought in Vietnam. Mm-hmm. We don't know any of those things.
And in the current era, have we kind of swung back, or?
I now have occasion from time to time to meet young people who are thinking or planning to get into a career in the Navy, or who are junior officers in the Navy. There have been a couple of programs here in Grand Rapids, And there were Aegis ships that went into commission. I went to commissioning ceremonies after I retired. And those young people are so much more motivated. It's inspiring to meet them. But they're not the same kids that we have elsewhere in our society, by and large. They're very different.
Yeah, to some extent, the military is becoming more of its own culture and a little bit more separate from.
Well, could be.
Yeah. All right. Well, listen, thank you very much for taking the time to share your story with us. It's unique. I haven't had one quite like it before, so thank you.
Well, thank you.